I want you to imagine this scenario.
Polly says,
Mouthwash! Mouthwash!
I see it so clearly. There's a crack in the wall. Behind God's back. Healing the Lord, electric and constant. We're already here.
We begin mouthwashing with an overview of the Tulpar's space travel, with the 5-person crew on board. This is the Pony Express long-haul space freighter, which delivers supplies and goods to different places in space. I hope this hurts. There is an unknown mass heading towards the ship, and you need to steer left. After what I'm sure is an accident, the autopilot thankfully takes over to avoid the crash. Upon opening a locker in the cockpit where you find the ID of Anya, we get the master key and unlock the big red button? Wait, what are we doing? Disengage autopilot? The crash is imminent, but there is nothing else to be done. Upon leaving too, as Jacksepticeye says, to tell the crew the horrible news, we see some posters of some sort of mascot character. His eyes follow us everywhere, remind us of. We travel the endless maze-like hallway, not necessarily looking for an escape, but looking for something. More and more posters, more and more eyes on you. You can't return to Earth. Not after everything you've done. And then we see one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. We hear a baby crying in the background. The ship begins to break down, sparks flying everywhere. We continue our search. And then, Polly. We pick up 2 months after the crash as we now follow the crew from the perspective of Jimmy, the former co-pilot and now captain. And that's it. This is not a game that can be retold through a video essay. It deserves better than that. You need to play it for yourself, so please go do that right now. Don't wait. You can come back to this video later, as this essay will assume you have played the entire game, or at the very least know the bare-bones skeleton of the story. So, if you're ready, I think it's time we dive headfirst into the single most disturbing game I've ever played. Mouthwashing. I think a question many people will have is, why is the game called Mouthwashing? Like, yeah, it's in the game, but to center a majority of the promo material and even name it after mouthwash is, well, it's a bit odd. Names are important, and is even something I struggle with as an artist myself. I think this comes down to two key factors, and the first one we'll be tackling is about the role of capitalism in mouthwashing. The second, then, will be tackled later in this video. Now, the Tolpar itself is a capitalistic nightmare, and it's clear that Pony Express cut a lot of corners when setting up its long hauls. But honestly, I feel like that's rather obvious to virtually everyone who's played or watched the game. Instead, I want to focus on how it impacts the characters, specifically. Curly is someone who has climbed the ladder of his career. He is at the pinnacle of cargo hauling, being the captain and pilot. And yet, he is unsatisfied. He wants to move careers because he believes there is more for him out there, a greater purpose. And this is incredibly interesting to me. If you're a subscriber to this channel, it's likely you've seen what is by far my most popular video on the channel, my analysis of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. And in that series, David Martinez has not the same path that Curly has, but rather shares that sense of a higher calling, to transcend the bounds of his means and become something more. In Edgerunners, this desire is fueled by the society he lives in, the City of Dreams, as well as the wishes of his mother, who wanted him at the top of Arasaka Tower. His pursuit then was riddled with low self-esteem, as the city has internally reinforced to him that he is worth nothing more than the trash that litters the street. We don't get a lot of backstory for Curly. I've heard we get a bit of the narrative behind him and Jimmy's relationship in the DLC for Wrong Organ's previous game, How Fish is Made. But this is an analysis of mouthwashing the game, so I don't want any supplementary material to get in the way of that, even interviews about the game. Despite a lack of significant backstory, we could still break down through a broader perspective how capitalism influences Curly. The basis of a free market system is that anyone can rise to the top of it. And while this is theoretically true, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that it's much harder, and importantly, much more complex than that. Your environment and wealth make it so you may have a lower or much higher starting point as compared to other people. Many impoverished neighborhoods also don't have the proper education, as the system is completely outdated, at least in the US. But even more importantly, just like David, being poor has a significant impact on self-esteem and how abstract your dreams become. The son of the Arasaka executive and Edgerunners had, assumably, a solidified dream. That is because he has seen firsthand the process of how to rise to the top, and knows that he has the means to make this possible. Someone like David, however, intentionally has a very abstract, loosely defined dream, to rise to the top of a metaphorical tower, which eventually becomes realized, kind of, by him climbing to the top of the literal tower. He does not understand the actual steps to achieve any level of success simply because no one around him has been successful. Then pair this with him knowing his place in society and internalizing that financial oppression within himself, and not only does he not know the steps, he can never actually visualize himself climbing them. It's kind of like being a YouTuber. Now, I was not raised impoverished. My family did not live paycheck to paycheck, although I basically do now. But the pursuit of such a lofty goal as full-time YouTube, well, I always tell myself I'll make it as a YouTuber. And while I'm just conceited enough to believe I have the ability to do that, I can't actually visualize it. It's not so much a goal as it is an abstract dream. And I think that's the main difference between someone like the son of the Arasaka executive and David Martinez. For an even more extreme example, let's take a look at Denji from Chainsaw Man. He not only doesn't know the steps, but he is so impoverished and down on his luck that his dreams don't even extend that far to know that those steps exist at all. Instead, his dreams are based around his primal instincts, is that's all he has to fall back on. Eating fancy toast and going on a date with a girl. This limited scope obviously applies to Genji, and to a lesser degree David, but even someone like Curly experiences this. Unless you're the dude that wasted like $40 billion to buy Twitter, there's always going to be someone more successful than you. Someone richer. The dream of becoming the best is not even just essentially unattainable, but even that is so purposely abstract that it keeps all the cogs in the machine moving. In voiceover note here, I think it says something that being the best is considered being the richest in this society. Just throwing that out there. Within a capitalistic society, everything is for profit. There is no deeper meaning than squeezing out as much money out of the population's labor as possible. The system does not view people as individual human beings, but rather parts of a whole. Money itself is based on value, but where does that value derive itself from? A market that has no higher value itself? Think about it. What purpose is there to generate more money other than the simple act of doing so? And this is to say nothing of how the entire system is for the benefit of a select few. But with even the richest people on this planet, they lack foundational purpose. Innate human nature says we must kill and gather our own food, and build our own houses with our hands. But in the last 2,000 to 3,000 years or so, that has drastically changed. You can't expect a species that's lived for 297,000 more years than that to instinctively catch up as fast as technology progresses. The greatest play ever written, Death of a Salesman, no arguing there, has many themes, with this being one of them. Willy Loman, the titular character, starts a garden, as to grow something with his own hands. In a world where value in money is so subjective, it helps to hold objective value in your hands. Instead of a direct deposit you got from working on something completely unrelated to human survival, like telemarketing or something, you can gain actual food that will sustain you. Of course, you do need a job to survive and buy groceries. I'm not that disconnected from reality. My greater point here is that we are so disconnected from our line of production and survival that we can't bear to watch a factory farming documentary, but can easily eat meat bought from the grocery store. Most people couldn't even kill an animal. But maybe that's my vegetarian side talking, who really knows. Also, voiceover note here again. Farmers kind of have that line of production. Some people do, but the vast majority of people don't. And being a farmer is really hard, so maybe that's not the right path. I don't even know. Furthermore, once we stop finding intrinsic value in our work, we also stop finding it in ourselves. As I've said, we are viewed as nothing more than cogs in a machine, and very little of us provide essential value to the survival of a specific machine. We are not needed for the livelihood of some small tribe. When Willie pronounces to the world, "I am Willy Loman," a scene that made me tear up when I saw it in person, that was him attempting to reclaim the inherent personal value he had never been born with in the first place. Even for the richest person in the world, Elon Musk, he isn't actually needed, and by a lot of people, he's not even wanted. He makes electric cars, fires rockets into space, and promotes conservative propaganda on a social media platform he previously stated needed to be politically neutral on the topic and its leadership. Even he lacks intrinsic value, even though he's climbed to the top of his own ladder, and in most people's eyes, the ladder of the world. Curly in this scenario is Musk. He has climbed to the very top of his career path. He doesn't really find any sense of fulfillment in it at all, because it doesn't have any inherent value. Even at the top, he is still so disconnected from the job he actually does and what purpose it provides to society that he likely doesn't even know what cargo is on board. So then, what is on board? What could possibly make this living nightmare, this hellish landscape, worth suffering through.
Polly says,
Mouthwash.
It's mouthwash. Literally mouthwash. I don't even own mouthwash, for God's sake. All of this for something that cleans your teeth just a little bit more. A little bit extra. It's not necessary for survival. If it were, perhaps the crew would have survived longer. This is part of the reason why I believe the game is called mouthwashing. It's actually comical that all of the suffering is for this product. To me, it's the ultimate antithesis to inherent human value. The perfect disconnect from human need. Jimmy is a whole other person to dissect, and while I'll be breaking him down completely in his own separate section, I do want to say this now. He's the David Martinez in this scenario, albeit much shittier. He isn't at the top and has no real vision of what that even looks like. When he becomes a new captain, all he ever says is, "I'll take care of it," all while ignoring the one thing he should actually be taking care of. Taking responsibility for. But don't worry, we'll be getting to that later. When Pony Express tells the crew this will be their last flight, that breaks Jimmy. The ladder he'd been trying to climb suddenly fell, and he had nowhere left to go. But importantly, none of this excuses his horrible actions, and most of them happened before the fact anyway. And as the brilliant film Saturday Night Fever points out, no matter what oppression you face, it's ultimately on you at the end of the day to, well, not be shitty. But again, we'll be getting into all of that. Capitalism itself seeps into every facet of the game. This is why Polly, the Pony Express mascot, appears everywhere. It is a symbol, the company always watching. It is also a pair of eyes that stare at Jimmy, reminding him of his sins. I think Swansea's final dialogue before he is shot says it all. Once he got his life together and moved up the ladder to make himself a better man, it was hollow, empty, because he wasn't doing what he wanted to do. Instead, his fondest memories are of him getting drunk. So then, what are we to do? Well, friends, I think the only answer to that is to live freely how we want to. With some obvious exceptions, of course. I'm looking at you, Jimmy. I want to be a filmmaker, and yet I've been told time and time again that I should just get a full-time job already. And while I understand this sentiment, I think so many of us go into jobs we hate, or can just barely tolerate, because we think we're supposed to. But even as a filmmaker, my dream, like I said, I offer nothing necessary to society. I'm still a cog in the machine, and I'm even more still disconnected from the production line. So what's the solution? Is there one? And my own answer to that is to live with intention. I've talked about Walden by Henry David Thoreau in another video. That one on The Wild Robot. Please go watch the movie and the video. It's really good. Actually, I just bought a copy of Walden 20 minutes before I wrote this section. And in the book, as Thoreau lives in a cabin in the woods, he ends off with one important thing. You don't have to live in a cabin in the woods to appreciate life. You just actually have to be present in each moment. And that can be hard in modern reality, is not every second is fun. And in this hyper reality we find ourselves in, where every second should be instantly fulfilling, well, it's hard to fulfill what Thoreau wants from us in the book. But as the film About Time tells us, we can still appreciate the small beauties of each moment, even if said moment isn't necessarily what we would call fun. A smile, a fresh cup of coffee in the morning, a small typo on a report that brings a chuckle. These things bring us something. And while that something isn't necessary for survival, or part of the production line, or even fun, it's still something special. In Walden, Thoreau, an avid reader himself, comes to find that he doesn't need to read books anymore, because the birds and trees have told him everything he needs to know. Live for those things. It doesn't matter if you're necessary, because you, by being alive on this beautiful planet, are beautiful. And I at least think that's what really matters. To end this section off, or this video if you're watching this separately, I want to share 2 poems I wrote. This wind, it is a soft one, that brushes only a gentle cheek. It carries with it a longing untold, unspoken except at this hour, this most intimate hour, where the sun sleeps and the moon finally reveals itself. Myself and the moon are friends, you see, as we laugh and share stories of days that are but a trifle. The swans join in on the fun and allow us to listen in on their quacks, those which could be a curse or a love confession to each other. I can't yet know which it is. And when all becomes quiet and we collectively sit in silence, the moon, the swans, and myself are at peace. And as a comforting dark engulfs us, we form what is called the night. Quiet ripples echo throughout a liquid space. The wind yields to disturb, but flows along with the current. Or rather, it perhaps creates the current. A question to ask when relating it to heaven and earth. Tap, tap, tap. The fairies dance upon the surface, a slow rumble reaching the water's depths. To what wonders may arise from this quiet force? A world unknown and unexplored, whispering during a noisy day but chanting on a silent night. Stomp, stomp, stomp. The trolls pace under the bridge, waiting for the time in which you will ask directions for your next journey. The sails of their ships are ready for your call. I implore you to heed it and explore, my friends. For what sights may await the curious mindscape. Go, run before it's too late. Leave this place and go. Flap, flap, flap. You see the pigeons, now white, fly invisible with the breeze, announcing the coming of the queen. Her feathers are clear, the future is near. Go towards that dying light. And with that angel, exploration is able. Fall into that inevitable night. If you enjoyed this video, just know it's actually a small snippet of a much, much larger analysis of mouthwashing. One that you will see on the channel soon. If you couldn't already tell from me saying in this later section a million times. So please, if you want to see all there is to uncover on this masterpiece of an indie gem, then subscribe to the channel. Might as well throw this video a like while you're down there. It certainly wouldn't hurt. And, as always, thank you for watching. Jimmy sexually assaulted Anya, and that is pretty much confirmed in the story. And yet it's still subtle, as I somehow didn't pick up on this fact during my playthrough, and had to look at comments on other videos to discover this. It's realistic, as Anya still has to sadly be near her abuser, which, again, is a reality for so many victims. It's not always easy to pick up on from an outsider's point of view, but Curly, well, he knew. He was, albeit indirectly, told this by Anya. One of the best conversations in the game is when Curly and Anya are talking about the moonlight screen 2 days before the crash. It's enlightening to say the least, and quite abstract, so I want to give my subjective opinion on what this scene means. Anya talks about how calming the moon picture is, but ultimately, it's not real. A facade. And in that beautiful, fake screen, she sees what she describes as a dead pixel. It's the ultimate reminder that this image she has in her head is just that. An image. A facade. It's not predicated on reality, but rather what the viewer wants to see. And in the back of her mind, Anya just can't get the thought of the dead pixel out of her mind, even though she wants to. Her subconscious, of course, has other plans, however. For me, the screen represents Jimmy. Anya talks so much in the game about our worst moments don't define us, and yet near the end of her life, she takes it back. She wanted to believe in it, but the dead pixel just kept obscuring the bigger picture. This dead pixel then would be Jimmy's assault, the action that reveals his entire image as a facade he fabricated. When she looks at Jimmy, even though she tries to not, all she sees is what he did to her. Rightfully so, obviously, the dude is a real piece of shit. But Curly doesn't see that. He doesn't see the dead pixel. His image of Jimmy is pure, incorruptible. I mean, he's known him for so long, right? All he sees, as he directly states, is the bigger picture, the facade. As he directly states, I don't think it ruins the illusion, though. Even when Anya asks why there are locks in the medbay and cockpit doors, but not the sleeping quarters, he simply responds with, safety. And that's just heart-shattering. Not all men are bad, but virtually all are, very importantly, complacent. They will defend their friends, even if those friends do bad things. Which means I lied. Almost our men are bad. I'm sorry if you're a man, as most of my audience is, and this alienates you. But you need to, as a man, look within yourself and introspect. Even if it wasn't something as bad as an assault, have you ever defended your shitty friends? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe it's no. I'm not sure. I don't know you or your friends. Also, obviously, women can do shitty things too, and then be defended by other women or even non-binary folks. But it's much less relevant. The facts, however, are this. Curly defends Jimmy. You can form your opinion on that, whatever it may be, whether or not he's a bad person, but I will say that it's complex. And yet, it's not. We need to condemn monstrous behavior, and yet we don't do it enough. We don't. We make jokes. We don't listen to victims enough. Curly is a complex character in his struggle, but that struggle itself is not that complex. The facts are that he knew Anya was pregnant with Jimmy's child, as she directly told him, and he knew that Jimmy sexually assaulted her, as she heavily insinuated and supported by him telling Jimmy that they can fix this. And the facts are, he kept him on the ship. Instead of helping Anya as much as possible, the victim, he instead went directly to his friend, to the abuser, and told him, we can figure this out. Jane Eyre is one of the greatest novels ever written, and I'm almost about to spoil the ending. Timestamp here to skip all that. In the book, at the end, Mr. Rochester is left disabled, completely reliant on Jane. This is a beautiful subversion of their previously established relationship, as well as the dynamics of most male protagonists and their female love interests. This fate, well, I would say it's quite similar to Curly. Now, Mr. Rochester was the abuser in his situation, and Curly was the compliant bystander, but the end result is the same. They're both left disabled, unable to take care of themselves, and it is the woman who takes up that job, thus giving them the power in the situation instead of the man. Except, sadly, in the case of mouthwashing, the man steals the power right back. Jimmy demeans Anya's skills as a nurse and eventually takes her role over completely. It's a subversion of a subversion, meaning it's the norm. The man has control. For so many women, this is the reality. So we can't shy away from it or say we're making it all about gender. Because women deserve better. Because men already made it about gender. Workplace sexual harassment is embarrassingly prevalent. I cannot pronounce that word for some reason. According to one study that I found at aauw.org, 34% of women said they've been sexually harassed at the workplace. 34%. Women just like Anya. This is why we need things like the Me Too movement. And for those that bemoan it and feminism as a whole, just know you're pathetic and I hate you. Now, out of the 34%, how many do you think had bystanders? Men that didn't exactly agree with the behavior, but still let it slide because, well, men will be men. Boys will be boys. I can't just turn in my friend, can I? How many lives could be saved if we stop pretending this is normal and okay? So, is Curly a bad person? Are men in general usually bad? That's for you to answer. But what I can't say is that if you were replaced with someone more compassionate and honestly just someone more competent, Anya would not have died. None of the crew would have. Curly didn't crash the Tulpar, but he, even if indirectly, led to its untimely demise. Anya is great, isn't she? Such a strong character for such a tragic story. And when she took her own life, my heart broke. Again, this was preventable. It's interesting to note that her text color is the same as Polly at the end of the game. They both play the role of watching Jimmy, wanting him to take responsibility for what he did. Her name in Nigerian, I believe, seems to translate to eye, as like an all-seeing eye. This pairs with the OST cover art of Anya putting a contact lens in. A contact lens into her eye. I saw a video from Risley right here on YouTube that from Anya's perspective, she told Curly she was pregnant, and then he crashed the ship. What went through her mind after that, well, only God himself knows. And yet, God has abandoned the crew. We even see it in the release date trailer.
I see it so clearly. Through the crack in the wall. Behind God's back. Telecolor, electric and constant. We're already here.
Behind God's back. All of this suffering is happening, and he doesn't even know about it. From the onset, we can see Anya is rather anxious, is what I would say, but as many comments I've seen have pointed out already, we are seeing her primarily through the eyes of her abuser, morphing her perspective on her as a person. And we also have to account for the fact that, well, she just doesn't want to be around him, for very, very obvious reasons. When Anya is talking to Curly in all of the flashbacks, she seems more sure of herself, and importantly, much more comfortable and expressive. She tells him about Jimmy's inappropriate comments that are disguised as jokes, to which of course Curly does nothing about, but it goes to show that Anya felt confident enough to, for all intents and purposes, to file an official complaint. So, no, it's not that she's an anxious person, it's just that she is anxious around her abuser, and that we see the story through his eyes. I've seen it theorized that the reason Anya can't give Curly his painkillers is because, well, it reminds her of Jimmy, specifically his assault on her. The sounds Curly gives off, well, I don't have to spell it out to you, how that would remind her of this assault. If this section seems a bit disjointed, it's because it is. And I find it to be incredibly interesting and incredibly tragic. I've already talked about Anya a lot in other sections, and in future sections I will be talking about her, but I thought she deserved her own section nonetheless. And now that I'm actually writing it, I find that I actually have very little to say. Because while there's little details here and there that we can pick up on, I'm more interested in the meat of this story, not the toppings. And with Anya, there just isn't a lot of that. And I honestly think that's intentional. The framing of the story always shows the perspective of the men. They are in control of the narrative. They have the power. And this is a disgusting reality of even the current day. We view mouthwashing not through the mind's eye of Anya, but through either her abuser or the bystander. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a really good anime. A great one even. So much so that I covered it on the channel already. And in that video, we took a look at the male gaze. I never promised not to do that thing that I'm pretty sure people don't like, but that helps me make these videos, and include an excerpt from other videos I made. So here is a relatively brief one discussing the male gaze. However, the difficulty arises in what the male gaze does to women internally. It becomes almost a second personality, one that observes and silently judges the behavior of any said woman. We take so much from art. We are influenced by it. When you constantly have men portraying the lives of women, those women in the audience, especially from a young formative age, are going to accept that this is how womanhood should be, internalizing that, and thus the male gaze is born. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off subverts the manic pixie dream girl. Honestly, even the original comic seems to do so as well, but the anime especially does this by directly telling us Ramona's story. However, I wouldn't necessarily say it subverts the male gaze, as it is ultimately written and even directed by men, namely Brian Lee O'Malley, the original Scott Pilgrim creator, Ben David Grabinski, and was directed by Abel Gongoro. At the end of the day, it can only go so far as to subvert the male gaze when it is written by men. But men can certainly be pro-feminist in their art, so it's a sticky situation. I still have to give them props for making such a Ramona Flowers-focused story and anime, while also recognizing the importance of women writers while writing women. But hey, I'm just a guy explaining to you what the male gaze is. Why take my word for it? Again, it's a relatively simple concept to understand, the male gaze, but it's very hard to actually combat. Not to get political, but I've seen many men specifically when talking about the most recent US election say rather distasteful things to and about women who voted openly for Trump. And I certainly get it, I hate Trump too, but let's take a step back for a second. As a man, I outright don't think it's your place to make such comments. But at the same time, we can recognize the internalized oppression many women face, so much so that it shapes their very opinions. I personally think Trump is a bad thing for women on many different fronts, some more obvious than others, and yet women still voted for him. And the vast majority had what they at least believed to be a good reason for doing that, even though I disagree with them, but a loud minority are openly anti-feminist. I believe the term is trad wife, someone who believes very strongly in traditional gender roles. And this is where it gets complex, friends, because I believe everyone should live the life they want. And if being a traditional stay-at-home mom to a family of 5, the dog included of course, makes someone happy, then I'm all for it. Who am I to say, especially as a man, that they're wrong for that? But we have to acknowledge here that they are raised in a society that tells them that's who they should be. So much so that their very desires are completely molded around that ideal. I think this very beautifully circles back to cyberpunk edgerunners, and David Martinez specifically. And now it's time for more excerpts. Sorry, LOL. I promise it's for a good reason. Oh yeah, and skip to this timestamp to avoid edgerunner spoilers. And yet, despite the choices he made, he still ended up in that cyberskeleton anyway, because often there are external factors that go beyond our control. Faraday's power-hungry attitude just can't be accounted for in David's plans. Yes, David always could have just walked away, and the show is clearly trying to tell us that he should have, but to call him stupid for not doing so would be missing the point. Those external factors beyond our control, they're what shape us. In a way, we kind of are those factors. Even Faraday, who serves as the final external wrench in David's life and ultimately his doom, is himself a man completely influenced by the external factors around him that are beyond his control. Edgerunners goes out of its way to show how different he is from the actual corpos. How his desperate scramble for wealth and power is compared to the relaxed, honestly indifferent attitude of the corpos who are actually in power. They see Faraday as nothing more than a dog, just as Faraday sees David. If he had been born into different circumstances, his entire attitude here would be completely different. He also wouldn't even be Faraday. In this way, Faraday himself is kind of this desperate scramble. So again, we have to apply the same logic to David. He does have a choice, yes, but any choice he does make almost completely hinges on everything in his life that came before. The dreams of his mom in Maine, his disregard for his own life, his anatomy that makes him able to handle cyberware at a high level, his love for Lucy, and most importantly, the place he was born, Night City. There are no happy endings here because there were never any happy beginnings. To me, that is the biggest tragedy of Edgerunners. Seeing David at the top of Arasaka Tower, shifting in and out of full-blown cyberpsychosis, smiling and exclaiming to his mom that he finally made it there, to the very top of Arasaka. He never needed a dream, he just needed a path. This climb up the corporate ladder had been repeated to him over and over by his mother, to the point where it was ingrained into his very soul. He just never realized it until these final moments, if he ever really did. But this is Night City, and he's a slum kid. The system never had a way for someone like him to make it to the top of that tower from the inside. No, perhaps this was the only way. Perhaps this was the only way he would ever be able to climb this tower, predetermined by his mother's one and dying wish since the day he was born, from the outside. It's a beautifully tragic moment, because as we've discussed, the most devastating parts of oppression are internal. Believing that your life has no value, pursuing goals unconsciously forced upon you by others, whole groups of people putting themselves down for committing crime and violent acts, even though it was the grander system that instilled this into them to begin with. It's much more nuanced than that. Not to sound like a cliche here, but you can leave Night City, but Night City won't leave you. Not so easily. Self-eternalized oppression, obviously caused by external oppression, is much, much harder to rid yourself of, especially when a lot of it is thought to be the result of intergenerational trauma in many respected groups of thought. It's all getting quite complex, isn't it? My grander point here is that any dreams or desires one may have are ultimately derived from external influence, and society's influence more specifically. A trad wife may want to fulfill a traditional gender role, but she only wants to do that most likely because that's what she's been taught to want, because of the male gaze, that internalized second self. Of course, we do need to draw a line here, even I realize that. We must understand these concepts, but this long, long road does inevitably ask the question, well, what even are you then? Do you have free will? And to answer that, I'd recommend going to watch all of my Doki Doki Literature Club videos, as I won't be distracting from the thesis of this video and talking about them. God knows I've already talked about it enough on the channel. When discussing the male gaze, I think the best example I always give is Dante's Divine Comedy, and the character of Beatrice specifically. An angelic figure meant to guide and thus save Dante. And Beatrice was actually a person in real life, at least it's theorized she existed. And Dante supposedly only met her on 2 occasions, yet became so in love with her he wrote multiple works based around her, and included her in the end of Purgatorio and in the entirety of Paradiso, which says a lot about Dante, but we won't be opening that can of worms today. This, to me, is the ultimate example of the male gaze. It is a man who immortalized the story of a woman, creating art around her that would go on to influence what other girls and women desired and thought of themselves. He taught them what love should be through his eyes, and gave them no opportunity to use their own minds to figure it out for themselves. I said this in my college thesis paper on my favorite novel ever, After Image, but I'll say it again here. The history of art is the history of the subjugation of women. We as people look to stories to tell us who we should be, what we should want. We look at fictional characters and try to model ourselves after them at a very young age. We are read bedtime stories as kids of a knight saving a princess, played romantic music, shown beautiful paintings of love, all crafted through the hands of a man. Thankfully, times have changed and women are slowly gaining more power and influence and creating more art, but that stuff still has a way of sticking. Maybe you weren't told those kind of bedtime stories as a child, but your parents sure were, and their parents, and their parents, and so on and so forth. Centuries of subjugation isn't suddenly just erased, as there is a shared lineage of oppression passed down by men, and even by other women. Anya is a victim of this. The game intentionally doesn't really give her the spotlight. It morphs her opinion of her as a shy and timid girl based entirely on Jimmy's opinion of her. She was a victim of sexual assault, which, voiceover note here, is basically what the story is mostly about, and yet we never really get to see her journey through that. Just glimpses. And again, I think that's intentional. That the game is trying to draw attention to this and make us ask ourselves why we can't simply write a section in a video essay strictly about Anya and the game's story, and instead go on a tirade about the male gaze in an anime that has nothing to do with mouthwashing. And don't worry, friends, because the meta commentary of this video gets even deeper. As you've heard me talk about the male gaze, you've probably forgotten the fact that I too am a man, piecing together the story of a woman. As I said, I have absolutely no place to tell women how to live their lives. And yet, here I am telling you about all of this, trying to influence your opinion. Quite a contradiction, isn't it? Swansea, despite everything, truly cared for Daisuke. Honestly, their relationship is probably the most healthy in the game, and that says a lot. Swansea is, well, he's kind of an asshole to Daisuke, but it's later revealed that he is most likely this way so that Daisuke doesn't end up miserable at a dead-end job just like him. Which, while it doesn't excuse him for being rather mean to Daisuke, it does show that he actually cares about him. Something that most of the crew can't really say about each other. The relationship in the game is rather toxic, with obvious ones being Anya and Jimmy, and Curly and Jimmy. Curly and Anya should be mentioned as well, as Curly does very little to help her when it is all said and done. And thinking about it more, Swansea and Daisuke are really the only ones who have a positive relationship with everyone in the crew, excluding, of course, Jimmy. Swansea in particular is a red herring, where he is initially portrayed as a potential villain of the story, only for it to come to light that the very character playing as is the villain. Honestly, voiceover note here, if you consider there's one hero of the story, it'd probably be Swansea. Yeah, I don't have too much to say about these two that I haven't already said in other sections. And consider I'm actually writing this section last, I'll leave it to you to discuss Swansea and Daisuke in the comments below. Seriously, I need to hear your thoughts on these two since I admittedly have very little. For all intents and purposes, Jimmy is our game's protagonist. We are playing in the mind of an abuser, whether we like it or not. I set out to reveal the second reason I believe the game is called Mouthwashing. Well, it's now time for that. And I had my theory, but going back to a pivotal scene of Curly confronting Jimmy, it was all but confirmed for me. Here, I'll just let the scene play out. It's a very important one. Mouthwash kills germs, but only 99% of them. You can try to drink mouthwash to erase your sins, but you'll only manage 99%. Does one bad action determine who you are? What about repeated bad actions? Are you a bad person if you have done bad things? And most importantly, are we defined by our worst moments? This is, to my estimations, the central question this game is trying to ask us. Not really about Jimmy, he's a very consistent piece of shit, but about us. About you. And honestly, I don't have an answer for that question. We've all done bad things in our lives. Literally everyone has. And while I do think, if egregious enough, like in Jimmy's case, one bad action can make you a bad person, well, we might be playing as Jimmy for a reason. To show us we are not all Jimmy. In reality, most of us are probably more similar to Curly. And it's interesting that this is the scene and the only one where we actually see Curly without being Mr. Rochestered. As if the game wants us not to pose this question to the obvious subject of Jimmy, who has an equally obvious answer of, well, yeah, of course he's a bad guy, and instead shift the question to the more ambiguous subject, Curly. If this is the central question of the game, then the entire crux the story hinges on would be the quote, "take responsibility." It's seen everywhere in mouthwashing, and as Jimmy says he'll take care of it, we see the path we should definitely not choose: to run away. We'll be getting more in depth about this specifically when I discuss the ending, which is like half this video, but what I will say here is this: running away is not taking responsibility. And no matter how far you run, no matter how much mouthwash you drink, it can only take care of 99%. You will never escape what you did unless you confront it head on. The game's meta structure reinforces this, with a scene where Jimmy literally lists off all of the tasks that you, the player, have had to do in the game as him. He is obsessed with responsibility and control, yet he has no sense of actual responsibility. He has no self-control. And it is Anya, as she mirrors what Jimmy has kept repeating throughout the entire game, who says her final words: "I'll take care of it," by ending her own life and the life of her unborn child. After Daisuke goes through the vents and gets heavily injured, Swansea takes pity on him. He decides to put him out of his misery and kill him with the axe. Jimmy gets the gun, and Curly can't help but laugh. This is exactly what Anya was so scared of. And now Curly can see just who Jimmy is, once it's too late. once he can't do anything about it. We then see Swansea run at Jimmy with presumably murderous intent. And this is extremely important, as it's unclear whether or not Jimmy is hallucinating here, as we see earlier that Jimmy sees a similar scene in the cockpit. But more importantly, all of the dream sequences in the game are not hallucinations. They're meant to show the subconscious state of Curly and especially Jimmy. They are a clever art trick, where things are not meant to be taken literally, but instead are much more abstract. The musical numbers, for example, for the most part, in Joker 2 are not hallucinations, but rather, again, are subjective, subconscious depictions of the minds of the characters. Hallucinations, however, are very literal. That's why the only plausible hallucination in the game is Swansea's 2 angry outbursts, but even those are probably a subconscious expression of Jimmy's guilt that are internal. A hallucination is a positive symptom of psychosis. That means it is something added on to the lived experience of the sufferer. It is, for example, believing it is raining inside of the house because you can physically feel the raindrops on your skin. That's at least my main hallucination. It's added on to lived reality. What a hallucination isn't, however, is what is seen in mouthwashing. As, and I can't stress this enough, this is just a utilization of art as a medium of subconscious depiction. And yet all I ever see are YouTubers saying these are hallucinations. And while this unintentionally, I'm sure, serves to further demonize psychosis, it is also just factually incorrect. I hesitate to say to take my word as law in these videos. I'm just a person, but I'm also a schizoaffective person. So in this case, take my word as law. I have both extensive knowledge and, more importantly, experience in this. Okay, quick rant over. 0 days before the crash. It's time to learn the truth. Anya tells Jimmy about the pregnancy, and of course Curly's reaction to this is to say he'll talk it out with her abuser and fix everything, even after she says she doesn't want him on the ship anymore. I've seen a lot of discourse online surrounding this concept. What is Curly supposed to do? To keep the balance and keep Jimmy under control, it does make sense to talk it out with him. I don't think the solution here is to literally shoot him, but there is a clear-cut solution. Put him in a cryopod. And honestly, I think that's the end of the discussion, although Jimmy is the co-pilot, so maybe that would cause some complications, but it's a better solution than leaving him out on his own, as we see in the game. As we make our way to the cockpit, we have a lot weighing on our minds. When we finally reach Jimmy, we have perhaps the most important conversation in the game. At least top 3 with the dead Pixo and Swansea's monologue. In a moment of hesitation, Curly lets Jimmy crash the ship. And while I think this conversation more or less speaks for itself, I do want to point out a running theme throughout the game. These people would rather die than fail according to the dystopian capitalistic society they live in. Swansea even says it at the start of the game, that the only thing worse than starving to death is to not get paid. I don't think Swansea is a man that pressed for cash, and that this instead points us to, again, this concept of failure. And what's interesting about this is that while failure is so evident within this system with endless possibilities, it's unclear what success is. While failure is starving to death at home, Swansea would rather starve to death on the ship than not get the money he's owed, the money he needs to survive. Which means it's probably not about the money necessarily. So while it's based in death, it's not necessarily defined by it. Success is even more abstract. While failure is both the death of the body and, more importantly I think, to at least Swansea, the death of the ego, success offers little substantial, substance. Even the richest people, the most successful according to the system, feel empty inside, or are just complete sociopaths anyway. Honestly, though, it's hard to actually discern whether or not the portrayal of the sad rich person is actually accurate to real life, or if it's just completely fabricated by rich people. The music of Post Malone, a personal favorite of mine, shines a light on this dilemma with the obvious song Rich and Sad, but more subtly with Something Real. Austin would give it all up for something of actual substance, and illustrates how the life of a rich person is still filled with the same inevitable existential questions of that of someone of lower financial stature. But of course, I'm not Post Malone, so I couldn't say for certain whether this depiction is just a fictional facade to, maybe get you to stream his albums more based entirely on relatability. I'm not really sure. What I am sure about, though, is that Curly, even for just a second, would rather die than have his reputation tarnished. Even if he's well off enough to get by financially. He is afraid, petrified even, to fail. To which there are so many ways to do so that it's even unclear which one pertains most to Curly. And it's just so abstract. Alright, I'm ending this on last minute voiceover note here. But it seems like it's not about death, right? And it's not even necessarily about success in a substance way. It's more of an abstract way. And I think this happens because we are born in this system and we are taught certain principles, right? We are shown what failure is, and failure is not succeeding. So it's like they go hand in hand, right? And that's where the death of the ego plays a part, where it's like, I guess I should say it this way. In my film America Dreamin', two of the characters discuss why people chase like success, or why people chase like they made it, you know? And I think a lot of that boils down to, obviously, like, people want to make it so they can give themselves a better life. But even more abstractly, I think it comes down to, like, we have this primal instinct to dominate the competition almost. And I think that mixes with this feeling of impacting the collective that has formed us, that has impacted us. And I think maybe that's what we see success as. And it's not really about living a better life. It's more so, like I said, a mixture of those two. And then obviously I'm not that delusional. Like, it is about living a more financially stable life. But it's like a combination of those three things, I think, makes up success, like why we pursue that. And failure then is like the exact opposite of that. It's not impacting the collective consciousness that has impacted us. It's this very abstract thing where it's not about the money necessarily. Like, I mean, even the money in the system is so abstract. It's so dependent on itself, like we've been talking about. Yeah, I don't know. These are just my thoughts. I literally am just adding this on last minute as I'm editing the voiceover for the previous part you just watched. Or actually, I'm editing this. Whatever. Those are just my thoughts. After he comes to his senses and goes to stop the crash, well, you know how he ends up. He has undoubtedly failed not society, but himself, his crew. Jimmy finally has his party. to celebrate what a great captain he has become. But instead of a speech, it's time to feast. Jimmy here reflects what I've been saying, in that he doesn't believe life is even worth living from Curly's perspective on their level. As if that matters. Chopping off Curly's leg is a great deconstruction. Not subversion, there's a difference. Of what I'm sure all of us were thinking was going to happen when we booted up the game. That this was going to be a story about a starving crew trapped in space, forced to resort to eating each other. So then, what does this scene mean? Curly to Jimmy is no longer a person. Honestly, he probably never was. No. Instead, he is a symbol of what Jimmy could never reach. He is capitalistic success incarnate. Everything Jimmy wishes for his own life, as he never once realizes, emotionally at least, why Curly was never satisfied with his life. Jimmy never understood that Curly held nothing of real value in his hands, aside from the lives of his crewmates, something that Jimmy has already destroyed. And while Curly does represent more than just this, something we'll be getting into a bit later in this section, I find it interesting that, eventually, Jimmy feeds Curly his own leg. Honestly, voiceover note here, much of the stuff that happens after the sequence probably just happens at this table, and it's all in Jimmy's mind, but whatever. What does this mean? Besides Jimmy wanting Curly to survive based on his own selfish desires for repentance. What does it mean not narratively, but symbolically? As we've discussed, there is no deeper existential meaning behind our current capitalistic system than simply producing more money. Usually for the rich, sure, but at its core, its very heart, it produces revolutionary innovation, not for the betterment of society, but for the sake of extracting more money out of the masses. It is a system that, fundamentally, exists only for itself. It's a cycle. We make money to fund innovative projects, sometimes at least, so that we can make money. We then use that money to fuel more projects so that we can make even more money. And while this does sometimes produce innovation, it also does the exact opposite at times. Just look at the healthcare system in the US and see the price gouging that is clearly evident. This is to the point that new research is even shut down because, well, the cures and treatments it would provide just wouldn't make enough money. An example would be ketogenic metabolic therapies to treat psychosis. The research was simply shut down, at least indirectly, because then you can't charge people for pills. While I could go on and on about the problems that arise when you base your country's medical system on making a profit, seriously, it's beyond evil. My grander point here is that you, yes, you, Jeff, are disposable in this system. You are meant to work, make money, and then buy stuff, and then work to buy more stuff, make more money, and buy more stuff. Over and over and over again. AI is already replacing hard workers around the world, even for high-entry, high-paying jobs. Even I use the self-checkout at my local Wegmans sometimes. Again, capitalism is a system that does not have any existential value outside of itself. And what I predict will happen is that this very system will literally eat itself alive. What Curly symbolizes is the endless cycle of earn and spend, with nothing real to show for it. He symbolizes a system that can, I at least think, only survive for so long, especially as the gap between the rich and the poor grows ever larger. While financial freedom can help people actually chase after essence in their lives, it doesn't lead them to it. It is not the end result, just the occasional byproduct. What Curly eating his own fucking legs symbolizes is the very system eating itself away, metabolizing slowly the meat of its core. A meat that has no value outside of that system. A meat entirely born from, derived from, and entirely dependent on itself. Curly eats his own leg because there is no food left on the ship. Capitalism eats itself because there is no intrinsic, existential meaning and value to be found here. It is the Ouroboros. It's time to take responsibility as we dive headfirst into the same vent system that we sent Daisuke into, that killed him. Don't turn around. Your sins crawl on your back. We fall. We fall into a capitalistic nightmare, forced back into the vents. I'm so sorry, Daisuke. We see Swansea tied up, further putting down our minds that he even ran at Jimmy, at us with that axe. And as you walk through the graveyard reflecting on our sins, a grave thought sets in. We are going to actually shoot Swansea. I'm letting this scene play out as it's simply just beautiful. In this dystopian modern system they find themselves in, nothing matters. Nothing but those nights being drunk. Swansea sees himself for what he is. But Jimmy, well, he just can't take responsibility. As after Swansea basically reveals he saved the cryopod for Daisuke, Jimmy says he's going to take care of it. That he's going to fix everything. right after everyone is already dead. And, well, Swansea says the only final words fit for this. Fuck you. Swansea is dead. Now it's just the two friends left. The eyes watch us as we live in the cycle. Never ending. Time to feed Curly. We have to find just the right way, the right amount of excuses to make the leg go down.
'Tis old Mother Goose's birthday, we're giving her a party.
A party, a party, a party for Mother Goose.
The baker man, he served the cake, it was a sight to see.
Mother Goose. A mother to be. A mother that shouldn't have had to be a mother. A mother taken from this earth much too early. It's interesting that the leg is produced from the TV, the exact one talking about the Mother Goose. This is where Curly becomes a second symbol, one that, we'll be talking about in a bit. As Jimmy sees himself in the TV, this is him perhaps seeing himself objectively for the first time. This is reflected in his conversation with the burning, even more Mr. Rochestered Curly. Curly actually takes responsibility, and it seems just for a second, Jimmy is doing the same. He gets on his knees and apologizes to Curly, and yet, while he won't consciously accept or acknowledge it, his subconscious has other plans. Jimmy sexually assaulted Anya, and his sins won't be forgiven so easily. The death of her and his unborn child still linger over him, haunting his very heart, his core self. But then, well, the baby is a horse? A pony? Why did Jimmy do it? That's the question. And while he felt allowed to do it because he's simply just a shitty person who doesn't view people as being, well, people, another representation of capitalism, and of course, Curly kind of enabling it, allowing it to happen, it doesn't really fully explain why he assaulted Anya. In a much earlier conversation in the game, when Curly is doing Jimmy's psych evaluation, he says something illuminating. I feel like we're in control here. I believe the unborn fetus in Jimmy's subconscious is Polly because he feels like, in this system, he has no control. And just like in Saturday Night Fever, he hates that. He needs to feel at least a semblance of control in his life. So he does what he believes it's his right to do. He assaults Anya. He gains control over a woman, someone who the system has deemed as lesser than even a lowlife like Jimmy. This is what a lot of cases of SA, most even, come down to. Control. But like I said with Saturday Night Fever, this isn't an excuse. I don't care if the system is keeping you down, you don't sexually assault people. That much should be obvious that it's an inexcusable action, but for Jimmy, he still hasn't even acknowledged it. He hasn't taken responsibility, he's just apologized to Curly. Even in the beginning of the game, Polly haunts Jimmy, reminding him he has no control, and even worse, serving as a reminder of what he has done even before the crash. But, of course, Jimmy can't hide from this. It should be obvious why. Secondly, the game is called Mouthwashing. Wash away all your sins with this simple product. Get rid of that bad taste in your mouth. But it's much too late for that, isn't it? As the polyamalgamation, a representation of Jimmy's gravest and most unacknowledged sin, chases you, you see the ones you've killed, either directly or indirectly, as the IDs of Swansea and Daisuke litter your vision. You can't forget them, not so easily. And yet, while hidden behind them, someone else is present. Anya. As much as you try, you can't push her completely aside. No, your subconscious has other plans. Caged and misunderstood, as if that could excuse your sins.
Polly.
And then, the best line in the game. Why are you still so concerned with him? We've discussed how Curly is a symbol for the capitalistic system. Honestly, we've discussed a lot today. But this right here is the most important line in the entire game. Because no matter how many times Jimmy says, "I'll take care of it," he still refuses to actually look at himself. He refuses to take actual accountability, and more specifically, responsibility. But as I've hammered home time and time again, no matter how much you try to suppress something, especially this awful, it will bubble up to the surface, just in an abstract way. The game Amori, which I'm sure most of you are familiar about, but don't worry, I won't spoil it, portrays this beautifully in its entire game structure. But mouthwashing, it might even do it better. And that is completely because of Curly. Curly for Jimmy is not one symbol, but two. We've discussed the first, but the second is even more complex. Throughout the game, Jimmy has skittered around responsibility the entire time, until the end, when he acknowledges that he was wrong. He was wrong because he wronged Curly. His mind even fully acknowledges his guilt over killing Swansea and leading Daisuke to his death, as shown in his nightmare sequences. It's very overt, but with Anya, it's abstract, almost nonsensical. He can't even separate the unborn fetus he created from his perceived victim complex. Even to the bitter end, he can't just fucking acknowledge Anya. Now, it's no coincidence that Jimmy has guilt over the men, but not the one woman in the game. It would seem, and others have theorized, that he doesn't really consciously see Anya as a person. Rather, she is a tool for his control. But even Jimmy knows that he messed up. He thinks of the consequences in his last real conversation with Curly before he crashes the ship. But that's where it ends. He never gets past the consequence of his actions into actual repentance for the very real person he assaulted. I don't have to explain the real world parallels here, how even modern society sees women and many other different groups of people that aren't white cis men as lesser. And look, I don't want to be the meme of we hate all men, but as a man, we have to, one, be better, but two, acknowledge your status. But even Curly, another man, is not a person to Jimmy. At least not fully. As I said, he is a symbol. And in this case, he is someone tangible for Jimmy. Someone or something that he can apologize to. Hoping it will wash away all of his sins. That it will get rid of the bad taste in his mouth. He puts everything into Curly because his suicide attempt with the ship is something that people can understand and even forgive. The wrong he did Curly is not something completely irredeemable or something people can never understand. Hence why Jimmy repeats to Polly that our worst moments don't make us bad people. Don't define us. Because in his mind, crashing the ship is the worst thing he's done. It was his worst moment, because his very mind can't bring itself to acknowledge that what he did to Anya was worse. Society can understand a failed suicide, and even a homicide attempt to a much, much lesser degree, albeit. Society cannot understand, however, sexual assault. As it shouldn't, I will add. Honestly, voiceover note here, a lot of people see sexual assault as actually worse than murder. So Jimmy hyper focuses on that sin, his wrongdoing of Curly. It all comes back to Curly. Jimmy has imprinted on Curly the side of himself that desperately wants forgiveness only for the sins he has actually acknowledged. Curly is his legacy. Not even just the man he always wanted to be, but an enduring symbol that can transcend his sins, his wrongdoings. That's why, in the end, Jimmy chooses to put Curly in the cryopod and then take his own life. When he says they will both make it through this, that he fixed it, he truly believes that. Because Curly has become representative of the side of Jimmy that he wants to survive and endure. The legacy he always wanted. Curly is his out. A limp body he can project all his dreams and nightmares onto. Something he can control. That's why he cares more about Curly when Anya locks herself in medical. To Jimmy, Curly is his escape from everything. But, of course, the worst sins can't be escaped from so easily. And, of course, Polly is well aware of this. Society is aware of this. The system itself is aware of this. Jimmy's very own subconscious is aware of this. Roll credits. The creators and team deserve it. I don't really know how to end this video. Stories like this aren't able to be tied together in a neat little bow. However, I will say this. Jimmy, all the Jimmys out there, whatever hell you find yourself burning in, well, I hope it fucking hurts. And, as always, thank you for watching.